All right, so let's dive into something pretty wild. Imagine just like scrolling through your phone and suddenly, bam, you're in a group chat with like the National Security Advisor and a bunch of top government officials talking about some seriously top secret military plans.
Yeah, that's like straight out of a movie, right?
Right. Like it sounds unbelievable, but this actually happened to a journalist. And well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack today in this deep dive.
It really makes you think about the kind of information that's flying around out there and how easily things can slip through the cracks.
Absolutely. So we're talking about this recent Signal chat leak involving folks from the Trump administration discussing military strikes in Yemen and all the fallout that came after it. And to get the full picture, we're going to be looking at a bunch of sources like Jeffrey Goldberg's report in The Atlantic, plus coverage from NBC News, CNN, Politico, Al Jazeera, and even official statements and timelines. We really want to get to the bottom of this.
Our mission today is to sort of sift through all this information and find those key details and, understand the different perspectives and the potential consequences without getting lost in all the noise of the 24/7 news cycle.
Exactly. We want to give you a clear understanding of what went down and why it matters so much. So let's start at the beginning with how this journalist, Jeffrey Goldberg, found himself in this totally unexpected situation. It all began on March 11th, 2025, when Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, gets a connection request on Signal, that encrypted messaging app, from a user named Michael Waltz. And well, as we all know, Michael Waltz is the U.S. National Security Advisor.
So you can imagine Goldberg's surprise, right? Getting a request from the National Security Advisor himself.
Yeah, that's got to raise some eyebrows, right? But he accepts the request anyway. And then a couple of days later, on March 13th, he's added to a Signal group chat called Houthi PC Small Group.
PC there, Goldberg figured probably stands for Principals Committee. And just so you know, the listeners up to speed, the Principals Committee is this high-level group within the executive branch where all the top officials get together to talk about, make decisions on really important national security stuff. So just the name of this group tells you how sensitive these conversations were.
Right, and that same day, March 13th, according to these reports, Mike Waltz starts a briefing in the chat. He mentions that the group is for coordination on Houthis, and that his deputy is putting together a Tiger team to handle the stuff that came up during a meeting earlier that morning at the White House Situation Room. He even asks for contact info from each member's team. Then the next day, March 14th, Waltz tells the group that a statement of conclusions with taskings per the president's guidance this morning should be in their high-side inboxes, basically their secure classified systems.
So we see the National Security Advisor using a commercial encrypted app to discuss super sensitive topics, but at the same time, he's talking about classified documents that would be handled through completely different secure channels. It makes you wonder about the protocols and how sensitive information is supposed to be handled.
For sure, and this is where things get really interesting. On that same day, March 14th, the reported chat logs show Vice President J.D. Vance expressing some serious concerns about the planned military strikes in Yemen. He specifically points out the potential negative impact on European trade, saying that about 3% of U.S. trade and a whopping 40% of European trade goes through the Suez Canal. He even questions whether President Trump fully understands how this action might contradict his message to Europe and suggests maybe delaying the strikes for a month. His exact words are quoted as, "I think we are making a mistake." I'm not sure the president is aware how inconsistent this is with his message on Europe right now. There is a strong argument for delaying this a month.
So you have this internal debate happening at the very top about a major foreign policy decision. Vance is clearly laying out a strategic concern that goes way beyond just the military objectives. He's thinking about the bigger picture, the geopolitical and economic fallout. And, listening to this exchange, you really hear that tension between the desire to act quickly and the potential for much wider consequences.
Exactly, but it seems like Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth didn't really agree with the vice president's concerns about a delay. He reportedly pushes back, arguing against any postponement. He brings up two main risks. First, he says delaying increases the chance of the plan leaking, which would make them look weak. And second, he says Israel might take action first. Or the Gaza ceasefire could fall apart and then the U.S. wouldn't be able to start the strikes on their own terms. Hegseth is quoted as saying, "One, this leaks, and we look indecisive too. Israel takes an action first, or Gaza ceasefire falls apart, and we don't get to start this on our own terms. We can manage both. We are prepared to execute, and if I had a final go or no-go vote, I believe we should."
So Hegseth's saying they got to maintain the element of surprise, control the timing. He's prioritizing taking decisive action, and maybe he doesn't trust that they can keep these plans under wraps for too long. But isn't there a counter-argument to be made here that the damage to U.S.-European relations, the bigger picture stuff that Vance was talking about, Wouldn't that outweigh the risk of a leak or Israel acting first? It seems like a big gamble to put speed over strategic alignment.
It's a good point, and the conversation reportedly takes another turn. There's a reported comment about a loathing of European freeloading, and Hegseth apparently agrees with this sentiment, even calls it pathetic. So it gives you a peek into the attitudes and the kind of thinking that might have been driving this whole discussion. Goldberg also notes that there were messages from CIA Director John Ratcliffe that might be interpreted as related to actual and current intelligence operations.
That's a pretty big detail, even if they weren't sharing classified info in the strictest sense. Talking about ongoing intelligence stuff on a non-secure platform is inherently risky. You have to wonder about the vulnerabilities of a platform like Signal compared to official classified systems. I mean, for you, the listener commercial apps, they might offer encryption, but they often lack the really robust security measures, government oversight, audit trails, the kind of stuff that's standard in official channels. So the risk of unauthorized access data breaches, sensitive info falling into the wrong hands, it's all much higher, as we're seeing here.
Absolutely. So let's get to what many would consider the heart of the issue. The actual leaked military plans. On March 15th at 11:44 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth allegedly sends a message labeled Team Update to this Signal chat. And this message, according to Jeffrey Goldberg's report in The Atlantic, contains some incredibly sensitive stuff, operational details of the planned U.S. military strikes in Yemen. It reportedly included the specific targets, even naming individuals, the types of weapons they were going to use, and the exact sequence of events as they were supposed to happen. Now, Goldberg chose not to reveal these specifics in his article. He didn't want to put military and intelligence personnel at risk if that info got out.
Yeah, that was a responsible move by Goldberg. It just shows how serious the information was that could have been compromised.
Right, and the timing here is crucial. This team update message was reportedly sent just hours before the strikes actually happened, which was around 2:00 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That same day, Goldberg himself talked about how significant this timeline was, saying, I, however, knew 2 hours before the first bombs exploded that the attack might be coming. The reason I knew this is that Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, had texted me the war plan at 11:44 a.m., 15:44 GMT. He later confirmed that the information was accurate when the strikes happened, as discussed tragically. Initial reports said at least 53 people, including children, were killed in these strikes.
And that's the core of the issue, right? It wasn't just about a journalist overhearing some policy talk. It was the disclosure of highly sensitive operational details about an imminent military action just hours before it happened. It created a window of vulnerability. What if hostile actors, the Houthis themselves, got access to this chat? They would have known about the strikes beforehand, maybe repositioned their forces, taken defensive measures. More lives could have been at risk, as Senator Wander later pointed out.
Exactly. So what does Goldberg do after the strikes? Well, he exits the Signal group chat, of course, and then he reaches out to Mike Waltz directly through Signal and sends emails to other officials trying to figure out, was this group for real? I was in there. Imagine being in Goldberg's shoes, suddenly privy to this level of sensitive information. It must have been a surreal and ethically complicated situation.
Yeah, it makes sense that he would want to verify what happened and how such a breach could even occur.
Right. And then came the official responses from the administration. President Trump himself defends Mike Waltz, saying he learned a lesson and that Goldberg being there had no impact at all, calling the whole thing a minor glitch. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt goes even further, claiming no classified material was sent to the thread and war plans were not discussed. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth says basically the same thing. Nobody was texting war plans. But then National Security Council spokesman Brian Hughes puts out a statement acknowledging the authenticity of the messages. He downplays the security risk, pointing to the successful operation. But he does mention that the NSC is reviewing how Goldberg got added to the chat in the first place. And then you have Vice President Vance's spokesperson issuing a statement saying Vance fully supports the administration's foreign policy, even though he had expressed reservations in the chat itself. It's interesting to see these different responses and some officials downplaying the severity, probably to minimize the political fallout and legal issues, while the NSC's statement hints that they know protocols were broken. This whole thing shows the tension between being transparent and protecting sensitive info, especially when something potentially damaging has just happened.
It is telling to see those different approaches, some outright denying the nature of the information, and then the NSC acknowledging that maybe procedures weren't followed correctly.
Absolutely. And naturally, this situation sparked a lot of concern and calls for investigations.
Yeah.
Democratic lawmakers were especially vocal, calling it an astonishingly cavalier approach to national security and demanding inquiries into the use of unapproved apps and the potential sharing of classified info, Which makes sense, right? The idea of top officials talking about military plans on a commercial app where a journalist could accidentally end up. It raises some big questions about security protocols and how seriously they treat this sensitive information at the highest levels.
Yeah, those concerns are valid. Using unofficial channels like that bypasses all the security protocols that are meant to protect classified information and ensure accountability.
We also saw Republican Senator John Cornyn calling for further investigation. He didn't say for sure whether classified info was discussed, but he was concerned about using commercial encrypted apps for these kinds of communications, and also about keeping proper government records. Cornyn's point is that this kind of communication could be a way to get around the rules for handling sensitive information and maintaining records, which are important for oversight and accountability.
Exactly. Official channels have specific regulations for record keeping and security, which you don't always get with commercial apps.
And then there's Democratic Senator Mark Warner, who didn't hold back at all. He criticized the intelligence officials for not taking the incident seriously enough, and even suggested that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth should resign. His reasoning was, if the Houthis had gotten this information before the strikes, it could have been disastrous. American lives could have been lost. He's quoted as saying, "Oh yes, if the Houthis had gotten this information, they could have repositioned their defenses, and American lives could have been and probably would have been lost." Warner's point really highlights the danger of a leak, even an accidental one. The fact that they shared specific operational details hours before the attack created a real vulnerability.
He's emphasizing the potential human cost of a security lapse like this and how crucial it is to keep military operations secret until they're actually happening.
There was also a Senate hearing where Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard and CIA Director John Ratcliffe testified. They both insisted that no classified material was shared in the signal chat, but reports suggest that Gabbard seemed to shift some of the blame to the Secretary of Defense. So maybe there's some internal disagreement or at least different interpretations of what happened and what kind of information was actually shared.
It shows how difficult it can be to figure out who's responsible in these situations and how people can have different ideas about what's a breach of protocol and how you handle sensitive information.
So beyond the immediate political fallout, what are the bigger legal and broader implications of this whole accidental insider situation? Well, there's the argument that National Security Advisor Mike Waltz might have violated the Espionage Act just by sharing sensitive military operational info with Jeffrey Goldberg, who didn't have the security clearance to receive it. The Espionage Act is the U.S. law that basically prevents people from sharing information related to national defense that could harm the U.S. or help a foreign nation. Intent is usually a key factor in these cases. But even accidentally sharing sensitive national security info can be a problem.
Yeah, that's a big legal issue. The Espionage Act is there to protect national security info, so sharing operational details, even unintentionally, could fall under that.
And even though President Trump publicly supported him, there are still questions about what this means for Mike Waltz's job as National Security Advisor. Politico quoted someone close to the White House who was very critical of Waltz. So you get a sense of the internal tension and potential fallout. Presidential support is important, but a security lapse this big can damage people's confidence and make things politically difficult. We've seen cases in other administrations where similar situations, even unintentional ones, led to resignations or people being moved to different positions.
Public trust is a big part of this, too. Something like this makes people question whether the government can protect sensitive information and whether they're competent enough to handle these situations.
And it's hard to ignore the comparisons to Hillary Clinton using a private email server when she was Secretary of State. Some of the people who were supposedly in this Signal chat were the ones who criticized Clinton the most for handling sensitive information through unofficial channels. So the irony is pretty clear. It shows how sensitive people are about how government officials communicate, especially when national security is involved, no matter what technology or administration. This really makes you wonder if administrations learn from these past experiences with secure communication.
It shows how hard it is to balance the need for quick communication with the absolute necessity of protecting sensitive government information.
And this whole thing has implications for public trust in the government's ability to handle sensitive info and how much scrutiny they'll face for their communication practices. We've seen similar things happen before, like those millions of U.S. military emails that were accidentally sent to Mali because of a typo, or troops using public apps to memorize security protocols. This Signal chat leak adds another layer showing that these vulnerabilities can exist everywhere and across different types of communication.
It's a reminder that they need strong security protocols, consistent training, and a real culture of security awareness in government at every level.
So to wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for you, the listener? We had a journalist accidentally end up in a private chat where they were discussing highly sensitive military plans in detail before they happened. It raises questions about security protocols, whether it's appropriate to use non-approved channels for this kind of stuff, and the accountability of top government officials. The different stories from officials and the call for investigations from both sides show how complex and potentially significant this accidental insider event is. We've gone through a lot of information here, but hopefully you now have a better understanding of this story and what it might mean without getting lost in all the news updates.
Yeah, by looking at what happened, the different perspectives and the potential legal and political consequences, we can understand the challenges of handling sensitive information in today's world.
Exactly, and with that in mind, here's a final thought for you to ponder with how easy and fast information can be shared today. What are the real risks of these kinds of accidental leaks, and what can we actually do to protect national security in this constantly changing world? This whole incident makes you think about the hidden vulnerabilities that might be out there in our increasingly interconnected world.